Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. I think what I will do is as I read each person's award, I'm going to have a paragraph on everybody. If you can go ahead and start walking up here and come up over here. And then at the very end, we're going to do a photo op with everybody. So everybody gets an award if you can stay. And then right at the end of the awards, we'll do that. And then we have a reception that will be, where? There. Okay, thank you. Okay, the first recipient for the ASC Minority Fellowship Award is Janet Garcia from Rutgers University. Janet received a BA in Sociology and Psychology from Macaulay Honors College in CUNY Hunter and an MA en route to her PhD from Rutgers School of Criminal Justice. Her research is primarily focused on the racial and ethnic differences in policing strategies and the impact of incarceration rates in the communities of color and the obstacles faced during women's reentry. Okay, so do we have a plaque forward just to check? The next recipient of this is Brittany Friedman from Northwestern University. Okay, thank you. Brittany is a PhD student in the Department of Sociology, as well as a graduate fellow at the Northwestern Center for Legal Studies. Her research examines how race, ethnicity, and social inequality relate to various configurations of organized crime, with a particular interest in correctional institutions and transnational networks. Congratulations. Okay, and the third recipient is Janice Awama from Northeastern University. Janice here. Janice is a doctoral candidate at the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice. Her research interests involve the impact of communities on crime, disproportionate minority contact, prevalence of hate crimes, racial and ethnic issues, and the victimization of immigrants. Is Janice here? No, okay. Okay, so now we are going to move on to the Jean Cart Student Paper Award recipients. First place is to Marin Wenger. The title of her paper is Clarifying the Relationship Between Racial Diversity and Crime, Neighborhoods versus Cities, and she is at Pennsylvania State University. Okay. Second place is to Adam Boson at the University of California, Irvine. The title of his paper is The Spatial Footprint and Daily Crime Patterns Situating Guardianship in 23 Cities. And for third place, we had co-authors, and Anthony Roberts and Aaron Wolbach of University of California, Riverside. And the title of their paper is Revisiting Deprivation and Homicide, a Cross-National Analysis of Age and Gender-Specific Victimization. Next, we have the Teaching Award, and this is for Laura Weber Brooks from the University of Maryland. Professor Brooks received her PhD at the University of Maryland in 1986 and is currently the director of the undergraduate studies for the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice at University of Maryland, where she's been teaching for over 30 years, during which time she has taught approximately 230 classes, instructed over 20,000 students. She served as an internship director for 10 years and is the faculty advisor for Alpha Phi Sigma Omega Iota chapter. She has received numerous teaching awards during her career, including the 2012 College of Behavioral and Social Sciences Dean's Medal, the 2012 College of Behavioral and Social Sciences Excellence in Teaching Award, and the 1999 College of Behavioral and Social Sciences Excellence in Teaching Mentorship Award. Okay, the Ruth Shanley Cavan Young Scholar Award, it goes to Callie Burt from Arizona State University. Professor Burt and a faculty affiliate is also a faculty affiliate of the School of Social Transformation and received her PhD in sociology from the University of Georgia. Her primary research interests are in the development and life course criminology, and her work focuses on elucidating the social, psychological, and biological mechanisms through which social stressors and supports influence antisocial behavior across the life course. The next award is the Outstanding Article Award recipients. These were co-authors Chong Min Na and Raymond Paternoster. The title of their paper is Can Self-Control Change Substantially Over Time? Rethinking the Relationship Between Self and Social Control. The Michael Hindelang Award, it goes to Robert J. Sampson of Harvard University. The title of his book is The Great American City, Chicago, and the Enduring Neighborhood Effect. As you know, most likely, Rob, yeah, go ahead. Rob is the Henry Ford II Professor of the Social Sciences at Harvard University and Director of the Boston Area Research Initiative. He also taught at the University of Chicago for 12 years and at the University of Illinois, and was a Senior Research Fellow at the American Bar Association. He was elected to the National Academy of Sciences in 2008 and is a Fellow of the American Society of Criminology, American Academy of Arts and Sciences, American Philosophical Society, and the American Academy of Political and Social Science. He has served as the President of the American Society of Criminology in 2011 to 12, and in June 2011, he and John Lobb received the Stockholm Prize in Criminology. And now for the ASC Fellows Award. There were 4 fellows this year. First is Kathleen Daly from Griffith University. Professor Daly, her work is on conventional and innovative justice responses to victimization in different contexts of violence. Her book, Readdressing Institutional Abuse of Children, which analyzes 19 major Australian and Canadian cases of historical institutional abuse, just came out. I have forthcoming here, but it just came out. It's out. And there's an author meets critic. Her 1983 book, Under the Gun, Weapons, Crime, and Violence in America, with co-authors James Wright and Peter Rossi, is a powerful and still very relevant treatise on gun violence. She is a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia and past president of the Australian and New Zealand Society of Criminology in 2005 to 9. My son calls me the most awkward person ever. Okay. Then also an ASC fellow is Finn Espenson from the University of Missouri, St. Louis. Finn is the E. Desmond Lee Professor of Youth Crime and Violence and also serves as the chair of the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice at UMSL. His research focuses, I'm not going to be able to read this with that light going down like that, thank you very much. His research focuses the nexus between research and policy, including both evaluation and basic research. Love the light show, can we have some lasers? Early in his career, he worked at the National Youth Survey and the Denver Youth Survey, and since 1994 has served as the principal investigator of 3 multi-site longitudinal evaluations of school-based prevention programs funded by the National Institute of Justice. Okay. Jody Miller is the next recipient. is professor at the School of Criminal Justice at Rutgers University. Her research utilizes qualitative methods to investigate how inequalities of gender, race, sexuality, and place shape participation in crime and risks for victimization. Her books include the award-winning Getting Played, African American Girls, Urban Inequality and Gendered Violence, and One of the Guys, Girls, Gangs, and Gender. Dr. Miller has published dozens of articles and book chapters, including in Criminology, Gender and Society and Science, Theoretical Criminology, and the British Journal of Criminology. She is past recipient of the Cora Ritchie Mann Award from the American Society of Criminology's Division on People of Color and Crime and the ASC Division on Women in Crime's Distinguished Scholar Award. Okay. And Alan Lizotte from the University of Albany. Professor Lizotte is Dean of the School of Criminal Justice at the University of Albany, where he has worked for 30 years. For the past 28 years, he has been co-principal investigator on the Rochester Youth Development Study, an ongoing longitudinal study of 1,000 families in Rochester. With colleagues, Dr. Lizotte has published several books and monographs, including Gangs and Delinquency and Developmental Perspective, which received the ASC's Michael J. Hindelang Book Award in 1993. In 2009, he received the University at Albany's President Award for Excellence in Research. He has published more than 70 articles in refereed journals. Thank you. The Herbert Block Award goes to Becky Block, Illinois Criminal Justice Information Authority. Becky was a senior research analyst at the Illinois Criminal Justice Information Authority, where she advised policymakers, researchers, and the public on the use of interpretation of data, especially measurement issues and violence prevention. She was the principal investigator of the Chicago Women's Health Risk Study, a large collaborative longitudinal study of lethal and non-lethal intimate partner violence. Beginning in the 1970s, she collected and maintained the Chicago Homicide Data Set. She also co-founded the Homicide Research Working Group in 1991. The August Vollmer Award goes to David P. Farrington from Cambridge University. Professor Farrington is the director of the Cambridge Study in Delinquent Development, emeritus professor of psychological criminology, and the emeritus fellow in the Institute of Criminology at Cambridge University, and has been president of the ASC, president of the European Association of Psychology and Law, and president of the British Society of Criminology, president of the Academy of Experimental Criminology, chair of the Division of the Forensic Psychology of the British Psychological Society, and a whole lot of other really impressive titles. The Thurston Sheldon and Eleanor Glick Award goes to Michael Levy of Cardiff University. Professor Levy has degrees from Oxford, Cambridge, Southampton, and Cardiff universities, and has been professor of criminology at Cardiff University since 1991. He's been conducting British and comparative research on the motivation, organization, and control of white-collar and organized crimes, corruption and money laundering, financing of terrorism since 1972, when he began his doctorate on the organization and control of bankruptcy fraud, the phantom capitalists. His current posts include president of the U.S. National White Collar Crime Research Consortium, member of the European Commission Group of Experts on Corruption, Organized Crime and Illicit Trade Council, and World Economic Forum. The Edwin Sutherland Award and Address it goes to David Weisberg from George Mason University and Hebrew University. Professor Weisberg is Distinguished Professor of Criminology, Law, and Society and Director of the Center for Evidence-Based Crime Policy at George Mason University. He is also the Walter E. Meyer Professor of Law and Criminal Justice at the Hebrew University and serves as a Senior Fellow at the Police Foundation in Washington, D.C. Professor Weisberg is author or editor of more than 20 books and more than 100 scientific articles on topics including crime hotspots, white-collar crime, policing, illicit markets, terrorism, research methods and statistics, and social deviance. He is a member of the Science Advisory Board of the Office of Justice Programs and the Steering Committee of the Campbell Crime and Justice Group, the Scientific Commission of the International Society of Criminology, and the Committee of Law and Justice in the National Research Council and the National Academy of Sciences. Professor Weisberg's awards include the 2010 Stockholm Prize in Criminology, the 2011 Klotchke Family Prize for the Advancements of Frontiers of Science, the 2014 Robert Borsch Award for the Distinctive Contributions to Research that Informs Public Policy, and the Jerry Lee Lifetime Award from ASC's Division of Experimental Criminology. Professor Weisberg is the founding editor of the Journal of Experimental Criminology and the editor of the Journal of Quantitative Criminology.
Little problem with audio-visual before, so I want to be careful. Well, it's really a tremendous honor to be the recipient of the American Society of Criminology's Sutherland Award. Though I've spent a good deal of my career, or important parts of it, outside the United States, I've always considered the ASC to be my intellectual home, so this has great meaning to me. And I also note that I'm sitting between everyone and dinner, so I'll try to do this relatively quickly. We should do these earlier maybe in the day, I don't know. Okay, I also, before, the title of my address is The Law of Crime Concentrations and the Criminology of Place, but before I start, I'd just like to take a moment to note my appreciation to the many colleagues, and especially students I've worked with in my career, who certainly deserve some of the accolade here in terms of the achievements that led to this award. I can't, of course, read them all, but I put them here on the screen, although it's a little hard to read. I want to also note Elise Woodich, who's a PhD student of mine now at Mason, who helped me with the analysis and other work for this paper. Who's a fantastic student, will be in the job market in a year for those out there that are looking. Well, John Laub, in his 2003 presidential address to the ASC, observed that criminology, the discipline of criminology, has a developmental life course with key turning points in its development, just like that of offenders. Now, he suggests that these turning points in the discipline of criminology have enriched our understanding of crime and justice. In my address today, I want to argue that we should take another turn in direction. The change is embedded, and was that of the influence of the Chicago School of Sociology that John noted, in the units of analysis that criminologists focus upon. But this new turning point is not concerned with communities, but with microgeographic crime hotspots. Now, in a 1989 article in Criminology, Lawrence Sherman coined the term the criminology of place for this area of study. And he argues that the criminology of place asks where done it rather than who done it. Like those guys on the right of the screen, if you can see them, three birds, and they're saying location, location, location. For criminology, location should be a key issue, just as it is for real estate and other areas. Now, the criminology of place examines microgeographic units, such as addresses, street segments, or clusters of street segments evidencing similar criminal behaviors. Now, here's where I'm going to go today. I'm going to first present data on the dominant units of analysis in criminology, illustrating that study of crime and place has received little attention. I'm then going to present evidence of a law of crime concentrations at places to illustrate why this is an area of significant opportunity for criminologists. And finally, I'm going to conclude with a call for a turning point in criminology focused on microgeographic crime hotspots. So what are the units of analysis that criminologists focused upon? My students and I looked at the journal Criminology from 1990 to 2014. Well, we chose Criminology because it's the journal of the most important and largest society of criminology, and also the most cited journal in the field. Now, what we found was not surprising, and I hope you can see it here. We found that the majority of studies focus on people. Microplace studies account for only about 3% of the empirical articles in criminology over the last 25 years. Now, I think it's important to note that in the early 1990s, there were hardly any articles that focused on crime in place. By 2010 to 2014, there were about 5%. But I think it's still reasonable to say, even if there's been some growth, that the criminology of place or crime in place is not a central feature of the landscape of empirical criminology. So the question becomes, why is a turning point warranted? So I'd like to use what I call a first principle of the criminology of place, the law of crime concentrations at places. Now, a number of studies of specific cities illustrate that crime is concentrated at very micro units of geography. But the problem in drawing conclusions from these is that they vary in the geographic units used, from addresses to cluster of addresses, to street segments, to cluster of street segments, to drug markets, etc. They vary in the type of crime data examined, for example, calls for service or crime incidents. And they vary in the terms of the types of crimes included in the studies, from violent crime to gun crime to general crime measures. They also vary in the quality of the coding of events, especially in the earlier studies. Many of the earlier studies, when police coded data, they didn't code the XY coordinates very well. Now, what I want to do today is examine a number of cities using data that examine the same geographic units, the street segment, I'll say more about that in a moment, the same type of data, crime incidents, the same measure of crime, a broad general measure of crime incidents, and carry out such observations with a reliable geocoding of events. And this has not been done before. You won't find an article that brings together a group of studies like this in which you're able to really create comparisons. What I'd like to ask is there evidence of a tightly clustered level of crime concentrations across cities? And is there also an example of this, or is there also evidence of this across time within cities? Now, just a note on why the street segment. It's both for theoretical and practical reasons. Liz Groff and Su-Ming Yang and I have written a book called The Criminology of Place, in which we detail many of these issues. But let me just say at the outset that we see street segments as not only physical units, but also social units with specific routines. It's a theoretical unit, if you like. Street segments, people tend to know each other fairly well. They know the routines of each other in the street. So in a sense, we view street segments as micro-communities. These street segments from intersection to intersection are also easily recognized by residents and have well-defined boundaries. And an important practical reason for this choice is that if you choose another unit like addresses, you often have a coding error in the addresses. By that I mean that police will often get the address of where something occurred wrong, but they'll seldom get the street wrong. So there are both theoretical and practical reasons for using the street segment. Now, we managed to find data on 8 cities. I've divided them into larger cities and smaller cities. No one's ever presented data on crime concentrations in micro-geographic data in smaller cities, though a student of mine is working on that now, Julia Hibden. But so there's something new in that, but as you'll see, they differ quite a bit. So I have them in 2 groups. The time periods vary, which will relate to my ability to show you something across time in a few minutes. But as I noted, we're using crime incidents, the same geographic unit, street segments, etc. Now, one of the issues here is what to do with intersections. If you define a street segment, there's an intersection, but that intersection is tied to 4 street segments. So there are all kinds of mathematical ways of doing this, but I decided in this case to just leave it out. Now, that has implications, but the implications vary across these cities. And generally, the majority, in some kinds, all of the crime is concentrated streets, is coded to street segments, for example, in Tel Aviv. And it's often the case that the kinds of crimes occurring in street segments, in many of these cities at least, are different from those that occur in intersections. In intersections, you have more traffic-related issues and things of that sort. Now, I don't expect you to read through this table, which I'm not sure is visible anyway from where you're sitting, but this is not a random sample of cities. There's no logic to this. It's a convenience sample. What's the convenience? Data I could get that I had that were coded this way, or that colleagues had that were coded this way. But nonetheless, if you look at the screen, you'll see that the cities vary tremendously. In terms of population, from 300,000 in Cincinnati to 8 million in New York City. From number of street segments to 13,000 in Cincinnati to 87,000 in New York. Even in terms of the length of the street segments, from 205 feet in Tel Aviv to the average length to about 445 in Cincinnati. And they differ on other characteristics as well, like poverty rate, percent of African American, and crime rates. So these cities are really different. Like Tel Aviv, Seattle, look at your own experiences. They are not alike. New York is very different from those cities, et cetera. So, though not a sort of random sample, we do have a great diversity, tremendous diversity here. But we don't have tremendous diversity in the concentration of crime at place. So what we have here, if we look at the percentage of street segments that produce 25% of the crime in these cities, we can see it only varies between 0.8 and 1.6%. In other words, crime is incredibly concentrated. For about 1% of the streets, you get to about 25% of the crime, which has led to many of the important policy implications of this work, that maybe we ought to focus crime prevention resources. But look at that band, 5 cities that differ tremendously. And yet the band of effect at that 1%, at that 25%, goes from just 0.8 to 1.6. If we look at the 50% line, well, on average, across these cities, about 5% of the street segments produce about 50% of the crime. And again, the band is really tight, going from about 4.2 to 6%. So there's an amazing sort of consistency across places that differ tremendously in concentrations, which led me to this differ tremendously in characteristics of the cities, and tremendous consistency in terms of concentrations, leading to this idea of the law of crime concentrations. I just want to take a minute to look at smaller cities, because no one had done it before, and it provides a similar type argument, but a little bit different. Again, the cities differ quite a lot from each other, and they differ an awful lot from the larger cities. For example, the largest of these smaller cities is 100,000 population, as opposed to almost 400,000 in Cincinnati. And the average length of street segments, I should note, is very large. I think that's an experience we all know about. You go into a sort of small suburban type city, and the streets tend to be longer, here going as large as 681 feet on average for a street segment. But again, these places differ an awful lot. And again, it's not a random sample. There's just variability across the streets, across the cities. But again, you can see tremendous consistency. If you look at the percent of the street segments that produce 25% of the crime, in these small cities, all 3 of them, between 0.4 and 0.6% of the street segments, produce 25% of the crime. For a police, for example, this has tremendous implications. You can get to 25% of the crime in your city by going to just 0.5% of the street segments. In terms of the 50% line, well, maybe there's a little bit more variability here. Brooklyn Park and Redlands are exactly the same, and that's not an error. Well, that really is the case that they come out exactly the same. It's not exactly the same if you push this off a few decimal points. Ventura is slightly less concentrated, about 3.4%. But there's certainly, even if we take these 2 groups, the concentrations for 1% go from 0.4 to 1.6 or 1.8. For the 50% line from 2.1 to 6%, there's certainly a tight band here of concentrations across cities. And there seems to be, something for future research, some difference in concentrations between smaller and larger cities. Now, does this law of crime concentrations at places apply across time as well as across cities? And I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but you have 2 pieces of information. I was able to do this with 4 of the cities. One piece is the top line, which is the number of crime incidents in the city. You can see in Tel Aviv, for example, during this time period that we were able to examine from 1990 to 2010, the amount of crime went up from 50 to 30,000, about 100% increase, and then declined about 30, 40% afterwards. But the line of crime concentrations remains relatively stable across the periods, whether we look at the 25% concentration line or the 50% concentration line. So it appears that not only is there this incredible small band across cities, but also across time. In Brooklyn Park, well, a little more differences at the 5% line, and part of this is scaling issues, right? But nonetheless, the tremendous stability, if you like, across time in the concentrations of crime, both for the 50 and 25% line. And this data is from 2000 to 2013. In Seattle, about a 25% crime drop in terms of the rate of crime, quite a lot. The crime concentrations, especially for the 1% line, remain very, very stable. Now, New York City seems to vary a bit from this. There's not much change in the crime incidence from 2004 to 2012, and to some degree it seems that the concentrations seem to follow that shape. Now, I think there's something interesting here as well to think about. Emil Durkheim had an idea. And I'll actually leave that, of a normal level of crime in society. And that idea develops over his idea that crime is a normal phenomenon. Every society is going to have it. When people have tried to examine that in terms of crime rates, what they found is the crime rates vary. Think of the Tel Aviv example before, where the crime rates went up 100% and down 40%. It doesn't work with crime rates, but it works to some degree with concentrations. Maybe Durkheim's idea of normal crime is not about the amount of crime in cities. It's about the concentration of crime in cities. That's normally distributed. About 5% of the streets in larger cities produce about 50% of the crime, and about 1% of the streets produce 25% of the crime. Now, this is a principle. It's what I call the law of crime concentrations. I'm going to say something about Sutherland in a few minutes and this issue. But let me just give an example. We saw before that very little of criminology has been focused on this sort of problem. It's sort of an open area. So there are all kinds of opportunities here, what I call unanswered questions, but also opportunities that are based on this first principle, if you like, of the law of crime, of the criminology of place. What explains the concentration of crime at place? There are a few studies in this regard. A study I've done with Liz Groff and Suming Yang that I mentioned earlier, a study being done by Anderson and others in Canada. But overall, compare this to 50 years of trying to understand the concentrations of offending among particular high-rate offenders, for example, it's hardly been looked at. Should there be different models for different types of crime? We don't know. Are there circumstances in which the law of crime concentrations does not apply? It's hard to believe it's going to apply everywhere in the same. I mean, the level of consistency I've got here surprises me. I'd like someone to go out and find examples where this does not work, perhaps in other countries, perhaps in cities, in different sorts of cities. What is the relationship between the law of crime concentrations and the 80-20 rule in economics? This is not the only place where you find a concentration rule, or the 90-10 rule in computer science. I mean, how does this relate to other fields that are also finding levels of concentration in behavior? In economics, for example, 80% of sales are done by 20% of businesses, right? So these sorts of questions, I think, are really crucial, and we haven't looked at them. Why is there stability of crime concentrations across cities and across time? Is this a function of social factors or factors related to such issues as land use and function? I tried to see if it was related to some of the factors that I was able to get here. For example, length of street segment. No, it doesn't seem to work. So we need to start looking at this more carefully. Can we find examples that violate the stability principle? I mean, it's something that violates the rule that's going to give us the most interesting findings here. Like, why does that happen? Okay. For all those reasons I've just mentioned, all those opportunities, I think it's time for another turning point in the developmental career of criminology that John Laub is focused upon. And let me go back to Sutherland, the Sutherland Address. He argued in his seminal text, Principles of Criminology, that general propositions of universal validity are the essence of science. And he noted then, in the 1930s and 40s, that criminology has not yet developed such principles. He was working in that direction. But you know, we can identify such principles today. We have the age crime curve, Wolfgang's observation that high-rate offenders produce most crime. These are principles that seem to apply universally across populations that we examine. But such principles are still rare. So not only are there a lot of open questions to examine in the criminology of place, it's also the case that even in this very early part of development in which a very small number of criminologists have taken a look at this landscape, we have generated a general principle, the law of crime concentrations at places that I described today. Now I'd like to quote from Frank Cullen's Sutherland Address in 2010, which I really enjoyed. He said, "For over half a century, criminology has been dominated by a paradigm, adolescent limited criminology, which he calls ALC, that has privileged the use of self-report surveys of adolescents to test sociological theories of criminal behavior, and has embraced the view that nothing works to control crime. Although ALC has created knowledge, opposed injustice, and advanced scholars' careers, it has outlived its utility. The time has come for criminologists to choose a different future." Well, I think study of crime at place offers a new direction with significant promise for theory and practice, and I've already given you some examples for that. It has received little attention so far. For the young people in the audience, it's a tremendous opportunity to study something new and see what you learn, to find those examples of deviations that we haven't found yet. Alvin Coulden wrote an article, which I believe had a title like The Minotaur or something, and it was about the sociology of deviance. And he said, you know what, and this was written, I believe, in the 1960s, he said, you know, at the beginning, you could be the great white hunter and identify some form of deviance that we never knew about before. But he said, after a while, you can't do that anymore. You have to do something different. Well, I'd say that in this area still, you can be the great white hunter, and that can be a lot of fun. And I want to say something else. Frank noted the fact that a lot of the work he was referring to didn't seem to have strong policy implications about the control of crime. Well, even though this area is relatively new and it hasn't received much attention, it has yielded evidence of strong crime prevention gains. The logic is simple. If crime is concentrated, then crime and justice intervention should be concentrated. Now, on the right of the screen is a meta-analysis done by Anthony Braga, Andrew Papacristo, David Durow, in which they show that hotspots policing across a large number of studies, a large group of them experiments, shows strong crime prevention, at least moderate and consistent crime prevention impacts. Here is an area where we have strong policy implications already, at least for policing. And by the way, in that review, they show there's very little displacement. Indeed, when you focus in on those hotspots, you tend to get a diffusion of crime control benefits in the areas nearby. But there's also opportunities if law enforcement at these hotspots works. What about community interventions? What about bringing other sorts of economic interventions to those places? What about thinking about collective efficacy and other types of ideas and how we can change that at these microgeographic hotspots and have an effect? This is an open landscape. I invite you to participate. Well, I said I'd do this relatively quickly, I think even more quickly than I expected, but you all are hungry. These guys say it all. Location, location, location. It's time to take a turning point to look at the criminology of place. Thank you.